So if you've been living under a particularly big rock recently, you may be unaware that Disney is coming under a lot of fire. Disney made a career of making the first full-length cartoon movies and doing extremely well out of that. It created childhood memories for many of us. The first I ever saw in the cinema that I remember was Bambi. Traumatized me thoroughly. But many of us have got beloved memories of various Disney animated movies. Disney's been turning them into what I think of as LARPs, live action role plays. Recently, they're redoing the original story in a real plus CGI type way, and they're getting more and more animosity toward them for how they're doing it. So the most recent one, which is burning up the interwebs and YouTubes, and which I can't ignore, though I can normally ignore that sort of thing, is based on their original, and some people would argue the best, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It's been turned into not Snow White and the 7 or possibly 8, according to some photos, colorblind, not dwarves. Dunno, whatever. Anyway, so there's a lot of people criticizing that, and inevitably with that comes a lot of criticism for the Little Mermaid movie as well, which apparently made a lot of people very unhappy also. I didn't see it. The Little Mermaid came out a little bit too late to be a childhood basic for me. And I had come more recently enough out of childhood that I could remember the actual book, the Hans Christian Andersen book, The Little Mermaid. And here it is. I have had this book since I was about 6 or 7. It was read to me when I was young. I grew up to read it to myself. And Hans Christian Andersen writes beautifully. The Disney animation, of course, isn't much like the Hans Christian Andersen one, but a lot of people loved it. It's got some great songs. Poor Unfortunate Souls. There's been so many renditions of that song, and some of them are marvelous. People were not happy with that. Many people were not happy with that new Disney LARP. And I say LARP as a reenactor. LARPing, I'm sure, is plenty of fun. It's basically D&D, only you steal your mum's laundry basket lid and pretend it's a shield, or you make a sword out of a pool noodle. And some LARPers do an amazing job, but as a historical reenactor, I like there to be history and accuracy. So a lot of LARPers do a poor job, and I feel that Disney is starting to do a bit of a poor job with their LARPing. Based on photos that I've seen online, allegedly. Yes, so The Little Mermaid bears very little resemblance to the Disney version. I assume that Disney owns the rights to The Little Mermaid, and that's why they are making and remaking the same previously successful plot, when Hans Christian Andersen wrote an awful lot of fairy tales. Many of these would make an excellent movie. Why aren't they doing The Princess and the Pea? Big Klaus, Little Klaus. Actually, no, maybe you shouldn't do that for children. But yes, many other fairy tales out there that could be done. I've never read the original for Cinderella, so I wasn't offended by the Cinderella remake in 2015, but I don't watch movies so much. I tend to generally regard them as wasted reading time. Now, The Little Mermaid, which is a classic and beautifully written tale, there's a few points about that I think relate to all the controversy that Disney's accrued due to their recent redoings. In this novel, or small book, or novella, or whatever it is, there are illustrations that are combined from 13 different countries where this story was published. Many of the translations may not have been that good. This particular translation is meant to stay true to the Danish, and it's got a large foreword about Hans Christian Andersen and the writing, which I think is why my mother liked it. She liked the foreword, I liked the story. Worked for all of us. But back to those illustrations. 13 different countries, 10 of them from Europe, but also including Japan and China. So about some of the controversy about this movie. If a child in Japan from the late 1800s through the entire 1900s speaking Japanese can enjoy this story, if a child in China speaking either Cantonese or Mandarin or whatever else can also enjoy this story, I personally don't see any problem with any person of any gender from any nationality enjoying this story. And you can't make a character that is all genders and all nationalities. Not any way I can think of. So just make the story as it is. People will love it. People have been loving it since the 1800s. It's a no-brainer, Disney. Really. That said, this story is one of the ones that is ascribed to Hans Christian Andersen as being a story that he heard or learned as a child and then adapted. Andersen made no pretense of transcribing original folk stories. Some people like the Brothers Grimm did. Andersen didn't. He took the story and then he developed it and made it his own. And he made that clear in letters that he wrote to friends and family. So these stories aren't really originals anyway. And you can't really complain that they've been adapted from one movie to another, because they've already been adapted hundreds of times. They were adapted for Little Golden Books. They were adapted into Japanese, Cantonese and Mandarin, apparently, as well as German. The argument that they should remain Danish, I think, is a slightly weak one. And if Disney owns the copyrights, it's an argument that's doomed to fail. There was a ballet which was inspired the famous Danish statue to be made, apparently. That was an interesting story. There was a German opera, and I shudder to think what that was like. I love operas, but even so. Now, the real reason I'm reviewing this book is because in one of the many interweb things I saw about it, I heard that Disney adapted and changed it significantly because they wanted it to be darker. And that was the bit that gave me pause for thought. If you have read any original fairy stories, you will know that you do not need to make them artificially darker. All you really need to do is go back to the original and then decide how dark you want to be. If you want it really dark, fully suited for adults, then make the original. If you want it for modern children, you're going to have to trim that original back a bit, because fairy tales, they are dark. They are nasty. If they've got morals, they're deep hidden, and they certainly don't date to the 2020s. So, original character in this one has, to my way of thinking, a lot more depth than any of the Disney ones. In the original Disney movie, which everyone loved so much, Ariel was this frantic ADHD kid running all over the place. But in the novel, she's quiet, contemplative, and thoughtful. I actually like the novel version of The Little Mermaid considerably. She's not called Ariel. That was a Disney manifestation. It's a fairy tale. Hans Christian Andersen, who was a fascinating author, I'll talk more about him some other time perhaps, got a Crown-sponsored trip to Italy, during which he wrote a book that he thought was going to be the one that makes him famous. It was called The Improviatore. It was an adult book, and it was only after that he started writing fairy tales. One of his friends said that the Improviatore might make him famous, but the fairy tales will make him immortal, and his friend was right. Another thing that Andersen said in one of his letters, where was it? There's pride and blah, 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 blah. I have written them exactly the way I would tell them to a child. So that was the point. The Danish language had never really been used, as far as I can tell, according to this introduction, to write down fairy tales for children. They were word of mouth. And a lot of the stories that Andersen wrote, you couldn't actually track them from anywhere, because in the 1810s, 1820s, when he would have been hearing these fairy stories as a child, no one wrote fairy stories down. So Andersen is a great man in that sense. Harping once again on the fact of how beautiful this writing is and how it appeals to so many people, among these illustrations, I'll try and show you some of them, are originals from Denmark and also from all over the world. I wonder if... Look at some of this artwork, will you? In this story, The Little Mermaid is one of 6 sisters, I think. This one comes from Italy. And her sisters live in the sea, and he describes the sea life and the palace and the vegetation beautifully. As they reach the age of, is it 15 or 16? I think it's 15. They become old enough that they can actually swim up the waves and see the surface above. The youngest mermaid is the only one who's fascinated by the surface above. She's the one who has a drowned statue in her garden. She is fascinated, but because she's the youngest, she has to wait the longest. She waits patiently because she's a patient type. She's no Ariel. And as her sisters grow old enough, they go up to the sea surface and they describe amazing things like icebergs in a thunderstorm and ships fully lit up and whales spurting around them. All these amazing stories, and she has to wait till she's last. When she comes to the surface, what she sees is a ship under sail, fully lit up, that's absolutely beautiful, and there's a party for the prince on board, so she sees the prince for the first time. And then when the ship is wrecked, she saves the prince, brings him back to land. This is the USA illustration. And continues watching him from afar. At this point, a lot of the arguments against the Little Mermaid doing it all for love, in the original, it doesn't really hold together. She is fascinated by things above, and the prince has become the focus for her fascination. Is she really in love with him? The story never says, but it does say how the sea hag tells her bad stuff, basically. She can go up to the surface, but the prince has to love her more than mother and father and clasp his right hand in hers. But in this story, she doesn't give up everything for love. She develops a fascination with a different place and a different story, and she wants that to be her own. And so she gives away her voice. The witch cuts off her tongue in this story. I don't remember that happens in Disney. I think cutting off of tongues may not be quite Disney. The hag cuts off her tongue, gives her a drink to go to the surface with, and drink when she's on the surface. And the prince finds her, and she becomes part of his household. But every step she takes is like walking on knives. I don't remember that in Disney either. There's a lot of harsh fairy tale type themes in this. And she lives in the prince's house, and the prince loves her, but he doesn't love her that way because she's not a princess. And when his parents organize a marriage for him, he takes the little princess with him when he goes to that country. And when they get married, they spend their wedding night on board a ship. The rest of the princesses, her sisters, come to the surface with a knife. They've shorn off their hair and given it to the witch in return for the knife and one chance for the Little Mermaid to come back to the sea, and she doesn't. And so what happens is what happens to all the mermaids when they die, and this is part of the story early on, which her grandmother tells her. People on the surface above have a soul, which means that when they die, they go to a wonderful place and live forever. Very heavily Christian motif there, because these guys don't have a soul, and so they may live for 500 years, but when they die, they become foam and go all over the sea. It sounds like a wonderful option to me, personally. Clearly, the grandmother had never heard of hell. So there's a very Christian motif here about how humans are better than all other creatures. And the Little Mermaid, part of the Little Mermaid's journey was not just the prince, not just this way of life that she's fascinated by, but the quest for a soul. I can't see any modern fairy tale by Disney choosing to deal with that particular hot potato. But as fairy tales go, it works quite well. The only problem with the original is that right at the end, when she should die and become one with the foam, she's taken up by the daughters of air and is given another option, which is kind of weird. And apparently, back in the day, a lot of people thought that was the worst problem with this fairy tale as well, the over-romanticization. Now, while The Little Mermaid is unique and it's very much a Hans Christian Andersen tale, it's thought that it was based on another fairy tale that I've never got my hands on or heard of, anywhere except in this book, written by someone called Ingerman, and it's called Creatures of the Underworld. It must have been in German originally, and folk ballads. Ingerman's tale ends happily. Andersen's, however, had to end with the death of the Little Mermaid to keep its own story integrity. And he fought off that solution by bringing in the Daughters of the Air, which bore her soul aloft and gave her another chance at having a soul and having an eternal life. It's a fascinating book, and it is beautifully, beautifully written. If you like literature, you will enjoy reading this, because this is literary. The writing is lovely, and this translation is even lovelier. So, if you're looking for a short story or a novella, and literature is your thing, consider Hans Christian Andersen and his Little Mermaid, because it is very, very enjoyable if you find the right translation. I'm still not going to see the Disney movie.